basically help you maybe recognize a leader inside of you that is kind of calling to you. Because a lot of people look at leadership in the abstract. They look at leaders in examples, and those examples seem to be, just two steps ahead. But what they don't see is that leaders are also looking to give back. That's a big part of what they do. And they don't seem to get the complete learning of anything that they're working on until they actually package it and give it to someone else. But the packaging of it, that's where the world is getting so interesting, because some of the things that our guests would talk about are actually so complex, you just need them to give it to you. And that's really what computers have allowed us to do, is package knowledge and ability and give it to other people. And here today we have Scott Edgar. He's the co-founder of ARIS MD and the CTO. And Scott, you have had an incredible background in coding. There have been exits, there have been the dreams that many coders have when they first start to open the control panel.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. It's something I've had a passion for from a young age, and I've always enjoyed it. So I think it's awesome when you can kind of pair something that you enjoy doing with something that can actually sustain you.
Yeah, and so I want to give some understanding to the level you're coming from, because currently you're trying to solve one of, in my opinion, the most valuable problems that anyone could identify. And that's that medical error is one of the largest killers in some of the most advanced countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-boggling. One of the things that I recognized in the process of working on this is that the number of people who die from avoidable medical errors annually in the US is the equivalent to a city the size of Atlanta. I mean, that's almost 500,000 people. That is a mind-blowingly large number for something that could be avoided.
Wait a second. If somebody just like showed up and ended all of Atlanta tomorrow, there would be a war, right?
Yep.
And we're doing this annually by accident?
Absolutely.
How do you mean?
Well,
What qualifies as medical error?
so medical error is a pretty broad category, but the primary issues are things like misdiagnosis, surgical errors, and even just inexperience of a surgeon could contribute. You get medical problems even, and this doesn't fall under the avoidable medical error necessarily. I'm actually not sure if it falls into the category, but there are procedures, life-saving procedures that could be performed but won't be performed because insurance companies won't insure the doctor for the procedure.
Oh. So like until we are able to bring some level of certainty, they're going to be like off the table.
Yeah,
You're going to have to
basically,
go
yeah,
to sketchy countries to try to get this stuff done.
yeah. So if you had, and I can't think of a great example off the top of my head, but hypothetically, if you had a tumor that was right next to your spinal column or something, and the insurance company is looking at it and saying, well, there's a high probability that the patient doesn't survive this procedure, the insurer is going to say, we're not going to insure you for malpractice on this procedure. At which point the hospital is going to say to the surgeon, you're not doing this here.
Right. And until we're able to push those boundaries, we actually won't ever get to achieve those goals of being proficient at a surgery like that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Now, that's something that kind of ties into the solution that you brought. Can you explain a little bit about what ARIS MD does?
Yeah, so ARIS MD is an end-to-end solution in terms of medicine. So we work right from the diagnostic process, using the images and processing them with AI in order to assist and create diagnosis to ease the radiological burden on the system. And we also provide the ability to practice procedures on patient-specific data. So if you had a tumor, we could do a scan of you and then provide that imaging in a virtual reality setting where a surgeon could practice that surgery. And finally, we allow for an overlay of the actual patient data on the patient during the procedure so that the surgeon can see where to cut, where not to cut, and follow a plan that they've created in practice.
Okay, I need to unpack this a little bit. So first off, I gotta kind of process this in order. So at like regularly when people are going in to seek medical right now, they produce images, and these are really high quality images, right?
Well, yes and no. They have the capacity to be really high quality images, but they generally don't use the really high quality images. And the reason behind that is that a radiologist can only go through so much data. The machines are capable of producing so much data that a human can't conceivably go through them in a reasonable amount of time.
I see. So,
Radiologists are extremely expensive, and so they focus on using images that are typically 3 to 5 millimeters apart. So everything in between those slices that they take is not shown to the radiologist. They don't look at it.
man, so it's almost like when we're watching film, humans see it like 24 frames a second.
Hmm.
And you're saying that like if this were computers, everything you miss in between the frames, that would be captured.
Exactly.
So, and when we're talking about the high quality or high quality potential images, what we're referring to is I think it's a file type called DICOM.
It is. That's
And
correct.
it's what they take at hospitals. Like imagine like PDF is like what you get in offices.
Yes.
DICOM is the image type, like the JPEG of what comes out of X-rays, MRIs, CTs.
Yeah. Essentially, any diagnostic imaging is done in a DICOM format. It's a broad and extensible format, and it's used across the industry.
Okay, and so now you get these this potential, and now you're capturing this missing potential inside images, because as a human, I could only see 24 frames per second. As a radiologist, I can only review this many frames in my workday. And what you're going to do is actually look at all the frames and in between the frames, but not from a person.
Right.
And then, like, is I'm just trying to bring it to where I can see it, and it's almost like CAPTCHA. Like the computer's going to say, where do you see the traffic lights? But it's going to be, where do you see the tumors?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Where do you see the tumors? And as our medical system is set up right now, a radiologist still needs to look at those imaging. But if we take that entire data set where we have thousands of frames versus dozens of frames, and we can say to the radiologist, here's where the problems are, go look at this, then they actually can, in a timely fashion, go through those significant size data sets.
Right, like a heat map. Like
Yeah,
you're saying, it's all clear everywhere but here and here.
exactly.
All right, so now we're into that part where like all the people that we would say medical error killed, right? Like the members of, I don't think we should call it Atlanta anymore. Maybe we should call it Atlantis.
Sure.
This like city the size of Atlanta that is dying every year due to medical error. So now all of the people that would have just had the misfortune of their disease being in between the lines of where this film is viewed, they can stand up and leave.
Yeah, yep,
Right?
that's a good analogy. And I mean, if you look at it in terms of what the radiologist is gonna see, often with things like cancer, early detection is very critical. And if you're not looking at anything smaller than, say, 4 millimeters, you could very well miss something that's in a very early stage where it's very easily treatable versus something that has now grown to a point where, oh, now we have to deal with this. This is big enough that we can see it on this low resolution image. Uh, Now we can start treating it. But if we had started treating this 6 months ago, we would be done already.
Yeah. And you might be out of the woods. Whereas
Yeah,
like once that stuff levels up, it's crazy how much more it can build with momentum.
absolutely. I mean, things tend to grow exponentially. Every time a cell divides, you've got another cell. So you get a doubling factor every time it grows. Uh,
Like what they talk about with like, hey, would you like $1 million or a penny that duplicates every day?
yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. And so if we can get rid of it when it's a penny, but rather than $1 million, we can deal with things much earlier.
Okay, so now we've got these images and we've covered all of our blind spots, right? We're able to direct the doctors to the help.
Mhm.
But there's like other features of this that you were saying, like you've pulled this into virtual reality at this point.
Absolutely. I mean, we can do things as readily on a flat 2D screen as in virtual reality. But of course, if you take the analogy that a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth 1,000,000 words, well, then what is actually experiencing something worth? And I would argue that, using the same kind of scale, you're looking at 1,000,000,000 words. So virtual reality is the closest thing to actually experiencing something that you're going to get. And not only does it allow a surgeon to practice and perfect a procedure so that they can perform it with much less, anxiety or effort or risk, but it also allows for doctors to learn new techniques. I mean, one of
Wait
the
a
things
second.
that's
They call their when surgeons are doing surgery, they call it their practice, right?
right.
Like I never even really the thought of surgeons practicing
Mhm.
in virtual reality, and it would be on the anatomy that is what they're going to operate on.
Exactly. And I think that's a critical component is that you're not going to be surprised by something being different than what you're anticipating. I mean, humans, so radiologists, for example, can go through these images and they see all this stuff and they pass those images on to the doctor that are annotated by the radiologist so they know what they're dealing with. But
And if they're hearing your background, that's Maggie, right?
it is. I might have to move her out. So if that happens, you'll have to excuse me for just a moment. Uh, yeah, give me one moment.
That's not a problem. It's easier that people know what they're hearing in the background and it's not something that they need to call for help on. But to like recap while Scott moves Maggie out of the room is we're talking about surgeons that would essentially have possibly one of your loved ones' anatomies. And like I know this technology well. Like I help ARIS with pitch design. I'm also an investor, but like being able to unpack that with you step by step is something that we don't really get to do. I understand it holistically, but let's keep filling in the blanks here. So now we have essentially your anatomy, all of those scans in the highest resolution, or someone's anatomy, brought into virtual reality. Now, are we like this is where I think to give some context, how real is that, right? Like, are we just talking about size and shape?
I mean, it's going to be accurate to the same resolution as the imaging it comes from. And again, because we can take that image between the gaps, you're going to get something that is essentially sub-millimeter accurate to the actual patient anatomy.
Wow. So now that you've got the anatomy, like when you say practice, what happens? Like how real is this? What happens when you perform surgery in virtual reality? The inside's the inside.
The inside's the inside. Absolutely.
All
And
right.
I mean, one of the advantages is that because it's virtual reality rather than a real patient, the surgeon actually has the opportunity to peel back the skin, so to speak, and look inside before they actually make a cut. And so they can look inside and see where they're going and plan a route that's going to give them the best possible outcome. And then they can practice that route and ensure that it works and it's something they can do and it's something feasible. And of course, store their notes and their plan for this procedure prior to actually performing it.
Okay. So this is something where there's a very distinct contrast between what's happening now and what would happen then. So
Absolutely.
how do they decide without removing the skin, as you put it, where to cut now when they're doing like initial entry points?
So a surgeon has a general idea of where things are, and a surgeon's going to look at that imaging. They're going to look at the same imaging that a radiologist has looked at. But the capacity for a person to reconstruct those images in 3D is limited. I mean, we're able to do it to an extent, but it's never going to be perfect. Uh,
I see.
and so what they do is essentially they take an expectation of where things are based on past experience in anatomical textbooks and all of this stuff, but everybody is as different on the inside as they are on the outside. I mean, there's when you think about it, it makes complete sense. You and I, we all have the same facial features, but the location of those features, the size, the shape, they're not all the same. If they were, we'd all look the same. uh, the same is true on the inside. And it makes perfect sense when you consider it, but most people don't consider it because we all see growing up the same pictures of the body, like the one with the plastic overlays that you can peel back and see different layers of a person. All of those are very, very similar. And a person on the inside is not necessarily going to be the same.
So when we take a look at our Atlantis city now, for all the people that maybe would die due to the way that their body has an anomaly and the general entry points for surgery don't match up. Now all those people get to leave that city.
Yep, they all get to get up and leave as well. There's also a benefit on the training side of things. I mean, if over in New Atlantis they come up with a new technique for performing this surgery, chances are that the surgeon here in Atlantis doesn't know how to do the surgery that way. They also don't necessarily have time to take away from their practice to travel to New Atlantis to learn how to perform this procedure. We can allow them to learn it and practice it in a virtual environment so that there's no risk to a patient. There's no need to do costly things like find a cadaver or anything like that. They can just have somebody who knows how to do this procedure, instruct them virtually, and here's how you do it. And so we can actually skill up these surgeons at the same time.
So we could have the foremost expert in any given surgery with real anatomy from an actual interesting case that they would study in medicine to a limitless amount of students in a virtual environment, all practicing something that they would like to make safer so it can get insured.
Yes.
Do we practice a lot now?
On surgery?
Yeah.
I would say no. I think that so a surgeon is going to have some practice when they do their residency. They're essentially going to job shadow somebody who is a surgeon, and they're going to take over the reins and do some stuff while they're doing their residency. Outside of residency, the test to become certified as a surgeon is a written exam. There is no practical test. I mean, they pass their residency. That's the aspect of it that is a physical test. But in terms of actually becoming licensed to perform those surgeries, it's a written exam. Once they pass that, they are licensed to perform surgeries, and it's not your license to perform these specific surgeries that you practice in residencies. You are now able to do these surgeons. So at some point in their career, each and every one of these surgeons will be doing a surgery for the first time, and they'll be doing it on a live patient.
I wonder what the numbers are there. How many people in Atlantis, the city that sinks due to medical error, how many of those people were somebody's first try?
It's very difficult to say that. It's an industry where those kinds of statistics are very, very carefully guarded.
I think that, in a way you kind of have to in order to make the system work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like if all new doctors got sued to the point where they wouldn't want to be doctors anymore, and if you identified them through this way, like that would be something very, very challenging. But if we can solve this problem, it would make insurance less expensive as well, right?
Absolutely, for both the individual surgeon and the hospital itself. And realistically, I mean, it would be a pretty horrible thing if we had somebody who qualified to be a surgeon, went through, a decade of medical school, residency, all of this stuff, made a mistake in their first surgery and never worked again. That would be a terrible waste, because obviously human error is a factor. People will make mistakes. But the more we can limit those mistakes and the safer we can make things, the better the outcomes will be.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that that's a pretty interesting proposition overall. Now,
absolutely.
Now we've gone through this point where they're like practicing and so on, but now it's something that we get to like the actual practice of doing the surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take a look at, for example, neurosurgery, when they're planning for things like that, right now they're using an MRI that is like a 3D model, but displayed to them in 2 dimensions, right?
Right.
So they're looking at something that appears to be 3D, but they're looking at it in 2D.
Correct.
And these images, do they look like a lot like the inside of a patient's head?
I mean, it depends on the imaging, but I would say typically they're looking at slices. Like when you go to the dentist and they put your teeth up on a white board so you can see the X-ray through it. They're looking at a series of those where they can scroll through them like you're going through a flip book, and they can look at them and see what they see. But it's not the same as having something physically in front of you, or not so physically in front of you.
Yeah, like imagine that you're looking at Google Maps and you're using the regular maps and then you flick over and show the terrain.
Yes.
Right? Like it doesn't look like the terrain. Like an MRI doesn't look like what happens when you're viewing a brain, like physically.
Right. But then you jump into Street View and it's a different story.
Right. And that's the thing is like, isn't it one of like, it appears to me from the outside, and I'm probably wrong, but it appears to me that one of the things that would be a great skill for a surgeon is the ability to extrapolate from 2D to 3D.
Absolutely. I think that's actually a critical skill for any radiologist or surgeon, is the ability to translate those images. But again, the complexity of storing all of that information and translating it between mediums for a person is very difficult. You're going to note features that you see as important, but you're not going to note everything. You just don't have the mental capacity to do that.
Man. So that's something that is like a limitation not everybody realizes, is that the limit is time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if you can only view 24 frames a second and lives hang in the balance, and something else can do 24,000 frames a second, would you not defer to that?
Absolutely. I think 100% that would be the right choice.
So you're choosing to solve this problem that is going to save a city a year. This is a big idea.
Absolutely.
Did you always think like this?
So I definitely have to give credit to my co-founder Chandra on this one. She is definitely a big idea, big picture person, and I didn't see it in terms of the size and scope of the project until we started. But she's always had that vision to be able to look at things and say, "Look, here's a big problem, and we can solve it." And my part is essentially to bring those ideas into existence in terms of software.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty tall order.
Well, I suppose it depends on the order, but she hasn't been wrong so far.
Yeah, but like the problem she's asking you to choose or to solve, right? And I know Chandra, and actually Chandra's going to come on the show here next week. And we'll talk to her a little bit about this, but I could totally see how this would take place, where Chandra says, "Hey, Scott, this is wrong. We should fix it."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little more in-depth than that, because not only is she going to say we should fix it, but here's how we should fix it.
Yes.
And I think that's a critical component. It's easy to look at something and say like, oh, carbon dioxide emissions from cars are too high. We should fix that. That's a lot different than saying, here's an alternative and here's how we can fix it.
Yeah. The Maggie's, she's pretty, is she yelling at you?
She is yelling at me from another room. I've locked her out of this one.
Sometimes being a fur parent is tough.
Well, I apologize. I hope it's not too loud.
Yeah, so far I think that we're doing all right, but I just wanted to, for anybody who's listening here, to understand that Scott's dog is amazing, but it's a bit of a puppy. She's not very old, so she's requiring a little bit of attention. But to curve back to talking about Chandra is the way that you two communicate is like another level.
Yeah, I mean, we've known each other for a long time, and I think that with that comes a lot of understanding of how each other sees things and thinks about things, and I think that's been a great benefit for us in moving these ideas forward.
Take me back into that a little bit further. So, how old were you guys when you met?
Oh boy, we were pretty young. It was at a summer camp, and I can't recall off the top of my head how old we were, but
like before you started school?
No, I mean during school, but
like elementary school though.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really young at the time that you had met. And then what was the first project that you worked on together like you do now? Because Chandra is the CEO of ARIS MD. She is a patent author. and she's a brilliant strategist and an amazing connector.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about like one of the first projects that you decided to work on as a team, what was that?
Now, are we talking specific to technology, or are we talking in a more broad sense?
Open question.
So the first job that I did with Chandra was when we were kind of late teens, early 20s, and she decided that we were going to get into the flooring industry because it's an industry where there's no ticket required to essentially be a journeyman. And so she started a flooring business and had myself and some of our other friends working in and installing carpet and linoleum and other kinds of flooring on a contract basis.
Wow. What was that like?
I mean, it was all right. It's obviously flooring is not my passion so much as computers, but we hadn't gotten there yet.
But an interesting first try.
Yeah,
I did
and I
like
mean,
a
it did well.
rudimentary version of Skip the Dishes with a buddy where I operated the map and we actually went around and made relationships with all the restaurants that didn't do delivery.
Smart.
Yeah, but you try these things, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that's just it. The only way to find out if it's going to work is to try it.
Yeah. So you were saying that by that time, computers had already been your passion. How old were you when you first started becoming familiar with a computer?
Um,
Like you must have had one in your parents' house.
yeah, I was pretty young. I mean, I started playing around with the computer when I was about 4 years old.
Okay. And when you think about playing around a computer when you were 4 years old, that the around Windows or previous to Windows?
Oh, definitely, well previous to that.
Okay.
So the first computer I had was a Radio Shack computer called a TRS-80, also known as a Coco 2 or a Trash 80. Uh, they're super simple computers. At the time, they were pretty much state of the art, but I mean, compared to today's standards, I mean, your Casio calculator can do more than they could at that time.
Yeah, the thing I'm thinking about though is the interface because you were talking about being 4 years old and being interested in a computer, which would have likely meant you could have read by then.
I actually learned to read from the computer. So I had these programming books, and I mean, I don't remember. I was pretty young, but all of the stories that I've heard from family, I had these books on programming that were given to me, birthday presents, Christmas presents, kind of things, and I would copy the code from the book into the computer, and I had to learn to read so that I could understand the messages that I was getting back if something didn't work.
So the first things that you would have like understood was like bad command.
Yeah, something
Is that
like
what they
that.
used to say? Bad
Yeah.
command. Wow, I would have been like probably about 8 years old when I started to do these things. And I have none of the amazing talent that you have and the skill that you've acquired with computers. But I still remember what it was like back then when you were using directories and command prompt on computers, and
Oh,
that
this
would have been where
is
you started, right?
this even predates that. I mean, the computer had no hard drive. A disk drive was an external thing that you would have to buy to add to it. A lot of things were stored on cassette tapes, which really interesting medium. So that sound that people remember of a modem dialing up,
Yep.
it was the same kind of thing, but you would record it onto a cassette tape and play it back to the computer to load your files.
Right, because like computers, like you can choose how you're bringing in the zeros and the ones, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so all that is notes over time representing zeros and ones, right?
Exactly.
So the like the noise that we all knew, like the beeps and then the fuzz, the and
Yep.
stuff like that, that modem noise was a computer basically saying what it was doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you were at that age and you started to do these things, like I'm wondering, like, do you remember what you first wanted to do on computers? Like, were you making little games or what were you making?
So That computer came with a book that was programming in BASIC, and it had some, instruction on here's all the commands and here's how they work and here's some sample programs. And then I had books that had games in them that I would program in and play around with. And this actually, at that time, we didn't have an external disk drive, and the cassette recording was kind of, I mean, you would record it and hope. It didn't always work. I suspect in hindsight that the cable was not good that I was using, but no way for me to verify that now. So often I would have to retype these programs every time I wanted to try them. And I think that my family probably saw that as great because, I'd be sitting there playing with this thing for hours and not getting into anything else.
So that was kind of a big thing then, is that this would consume all your time?
Oh yeah. That would have been my favorite activity for most of childhood.
All right, so most of the time when people really hone on this, it's like an escape. Is that what it felt like for you?
I suppose, yeah.
And at what point, like, how they say once you get to like 10,000 hours was the old kind of adage for it, that you get to like that mastery level, you would have been consuming a lot of hours between the time you were 4 and 10.
Absolutely.
At what point did you know that you were beyond everyone around you?
With computers, I'd say pretty early. I mean, I had definitely some things that in hindsight, I'm like, that was an interesting choice. But I had things like my school binder had a computer on it, and I would sit there and practice typing on the little pretend keyboard on it. Obviously, it had no output or feedback, but it was a way to practice with that.
Do you know how fast you type?
It depends how much typing I'm doing at a given time, but anywhere from about 120 to 150 words a minute.
Wow. And so this was something that basically came from that. As you were learning to read, like the reference to the QWERTY keyboard would have been right there.
Not just that. When I was in elementary school, we had a program called Academic Challenge, where you would kind of get taken out of your class and go and do essentially a special class. And I don't remember how many days a week it was that this happened, but at least one day a week, we would go into the computer lab at the school. And one of the rules that the teacher had in the computer lab was that you had to finish a certain amount of stuff on a typing tutor before you were allowed to do other stuff. And so I would be doing that. And
so you're like racing for Oregon Trail or Brickles?
Absolutely. Yeah. There were only so many discs available, right? So you wanted to be the first one to finish. So you got choice of whatever you wanted to do.
I'd ruin my lunch hour, man. I'd be racing to get to Oregon Trail, and then my family would die of diphtheria or whatever. That's pretty interesting. So you started to see yourself just being miles ahead here. When did it start to like translate into you seeing this as like something that you wanted to do for work?
I mean, I was probably pre-teens to early teens, and I started doing consulting for friends and family where I would fix their computers and things like that. Because I mean, back then, people notoriously would do something that wasn't a good idea and their computer would stop working. This was not an abnormal thing to have happen. And so I would charge them, I think I was charging $35 an hour at that point. And I said, at this rate, I'll fix your computer, no problem.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my first exposure there, where it became kind of a business venture. I even made, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they had these recovery discs where you would stick the disc in your drive and it would try and diagnose and repair your computer and do all this stuff. So I made my own when I was probably 13 or 14. And so I could go over to somebody's house and throw this disc in, and most of the time it would fix the problem. And if it didn't fix the problem, then I could diagnose it and figure out what actually had to happen.
Wow. So when I look from like then to now, because like most musicians would say that they kind of made it when they've had a successful album
Mhm.
And most people that are in tech would probably say it when they have a successful exit. When you started churning that from a job into making something like almost like your recovery disc was a mixtape,
Mhm.
what did you start to like? What were your first few shots at making something that didn't exist?
Um, I mean, I guess the first one. So we had a business at one point where we were doing websites, but I mean, websites are kind of a known thing. Everybody's got them. It's kind of a foray into tech, and I've done a bunch of work in that space over the years. But I think the first one that was really kind of a successful productized thing that goes along the startup path where there's an idea and an exit and all of this stuff was probably Drift. Um, there was one that predates that, but it's not something that I can really discuss. So I think that's the best one to work with.
Okay, so now we're talking about Drift. Can you tell me more about what it is?
So Drift was an on-screen keyboard that was designed to solve the problem of essentially your hands drifting. So everybody's used to typing on a regular keyboard. You can feel where the keys are. It's easy to make sure your fingers stay lined up with those keys. The idea behind Drift was that when you're typing on a glass surface like an iPad, if you're not looking at that keyboard, your hands drift out of place and you start typing the wrong things. And so the concept there was to build a keyboard that would follow your hands so that that didn't happen.
Wow, because that was a huge problem. That's why a lot of people hated those early keyboards
Mhm.
on screen, is they said they were janky, like, oh, it's not hitting the buttons I'm hitting.
The problem isn't the keyboard. The problem is you moved your hands. You may not realize you've done it, but you did.
Man, so when you started so you started work on this, at what point did you know you had something?
Uh, I mean, so Drift spun out of another company that was building hardware keyboards. And there were hardware keyboards that were designed to be easy to clean. And so they also had a glass surface. And so I was translating some of the work there into a new medium, being mobile devices rather than hardware keyboards. And so I think at that point, and we went to TechCrunch Disrupt in 2013, and I think that was one of those moments where it really stood out that I mean there's definitely some there here. We ended up getting runner up at TechCrunch in 2013.
Wow. TechCrunch is like a concert.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and so as like someone that is always aspired to be into tech, like what was that moment like for you?
Um, so my first experience being on a public stage was at TechCrunch. And so the first time I got up on a stage in front of people, and I was operating the tech, I wasn't the one speaking. But my first time being up there, it was nerve wracking. I mean, there must have been 10,000 people in the audience.
And it's not 10,000 random people.
No,
Like I would really want to know what the average net worth is in a room like that, because like the whales in those rooms would bring it up significantly.
yeah, well, there's that, and also the level of technical competence. I mean, it's like displaying some new artwork to a room full of artists. Uh, you're showing something to people who actually have the knowledge and ability to critique it in a valid and real way.
So once you get that level of recognition, you're talking about something that ended up being successful. How did it go from there?
From there, it went quite well, actually. We had engagement with a bunch of different major companies, some of whom were interested in projects for their platforms, some of whom were interested in potential acquisitions, and eventually it was acquired, kind of an 11th hour deal with a pretty well known company.
Wow. I know a lot of this stuff you can't talk about. Is there anything you can talk about there?
Uh, so I think not only has it been long enough, but I think it's also been publicized. But Apple was the one that bought the company, and that was, I mean, that was a success. I mean, anytime you get something like that where you get an exit, I would say that's a win.
That takes me into this like one crazy moment that we actually had together. Was we were in Augmented World Expo, and then we went to Apple Park.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
like
It's an interesting place.
for me, I walk in there and we're holding the iPads, and it does like that augmented reality view of the whole facility. That was incredible. But being there with you was like being backstage, where all of a sudden you're like, hey, this is Randy. He's the president of keyboards for Apple International.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess it's different when you a different experience when you're with people who know other people in those places.
Well, I have to say it was a pretty wild experience for me. It was like being like backstage at something like the Rolling Stones, you know? It's that was what was that like, to um basically have accomplished that where Apple acquires something that you built?
Uh, I think it's a good feeling. It's validation of not only the idea but the effort that goes into it. Yeah, and I think it's just it's a reinforcement that this is something that I want to do and want to keep doing.
I would totally believe that. Now, after that, I find that like if I was following that musician analogy,
Mhm.
then that's once you have done a couple of these, the pressure on doing whatever you do next, or the things that you would say, okay, this is now big enough to inspire me, right?
Mhm.
Is that how you ended up with ARIS?
Um, Sort of. I don't want to get into that one too much because I want to leave. Chandra will tell that one so much better if you ask her the same question next week. Um, but Eris, I mean, she had the inspiration to put this together, and I was like, yeah, that's a great idea, and I think we can do that. So yeah, I mean, I think that having that success kind of puts you in a position where you feel like you can pick and choose the things that you want to do and to work on. Uh, for my part, I see myself more as like the Steve Wozniak type of guy, where I'll be behind the scenes and try and make things work. I don't have a desire to be in the spotlight or to have that microscope on me.
Yeah, the that side of it where you say like, yeah, this will work. That's incredible. Like I remember talking to you about an idea to measure houses.
Hmm.
And I was like, "Hey, what do you think about this? If we took like, the regular home like assistant like an Alexa and said, "Hey, can you make us ping and pick it up on the microphone and work with Wi-Fi? Could we understand the size of this space?"
Hmm.
And it took you about like 3 minutes of consideration, and you were like, "Yeah, you'd probably have to move it around a bit." The way you solve is so fast.
I mean, I think a lot of that is just experience. I mean, having looked at different problems and being able to apply methodologies from one place to another, and find ways to make things work within the confines of the problem.
Mm. And that's something that I've seen you do time and time again with just these little projects, or well, what I don't think other people would consider a little. And you'll be over the weekend, and all of a sudden you'll be back with like, yeah, I got that step done and that step, and we weren't even sure if the first step was possible. And you're like, yeah, I've done it over the weekend here. On to the next.
I mean, I love puzzles. That's always been something that I've enjoyed, and I think that solving things that are complex and finding novel ways of doing something is a great way to, I guess, recreate that experience. You know how if you do a puzzle, and I don't mean like a jigsaw puzzle, I mean like a logic puzzle or whatever it happens to be. Once you've done enough of them, they become so familiar that you can just solve them without really thinking about it. And so every time there's a new idea, it's an opportunity to find a new puzzle and a new solution and a new way to do things. And I like that kind of mental exercise.
And what do you think about like is there like right now you're working on this great incredible project, and do you imagine that like you in another world there was something else that you were like, man, if I ever had time I would want to go do this?
I can say with absolute certainty that there have been several ideas we've had along the way with ARIS where Chandra and I were like, maybe we should put this one in our back pocket for later.
That's great. So these are things that you're not even thinking about them as being like, oh yeah, I won't get to do this. You're like, yeah, this is next.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that kind of gives a break in the I guess a break in the problem. Like sometimes the only way that you're going to solve something is to walk away from it and do something else for a bit, and just kind of let your subconscious process things. And so those kinds of things, it's like a mental exercise of, oh, okay, well let's solve how this might work, and then we can come back to it later, down the road, or not. I mean, maybe somebody else will come up with it and do it in the meantime. Who knows? But you kind of gather a collection of these possible ideas, and then once we finish with this venture, we can move on and be like, oh, okay, well, what's the next one? What's the biggest market? What's the biggest challenge? What's the most interesting problem that we can work on next?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. I was wondering if you ever felt like you were challenged by being here. Like you're in Edmonton. Is that something that you had looked at as being a disadvantage, considering that there's so many hubs for tech in other places?
Well, one of the biggest disadvantages that Canada has is population. We do not have a concentrated enough market for a lot of things. I mean, imagine if Uber had tried to start in Edmonton, for example. There's just not enough population. And so, yeah, that has definitely crossed my mind. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. I've spent time in other places for generally shorter periods of time, but I've been in other places. And the environment here for startups and tech is not as conducive to success as other markets. I would agree with that. But at the same time, I mean, we look at things and you build a global company. And so we are where we need to be. Yes, we're in Edmonton right now, but other places are just a plane right away.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of that. You've been all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I remember in 2018 or 19 when we were talking, and you had been, I don't think that you had been home for more than 30 days in a year.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well, longer than that. I mean, the longest stretch that I can recall was that I was away from home for, I think, 18 months. Not to say I never came back to Edmonton, but never got as far as coming back to my house. I would just, stay somewhere closer to the airport because we'd be on the way again right away.
Wow. So just like literally a stop in and then back away.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about why startups do this, you're going to explore, right? You're going to take your ideas places that will challenge it.
Hmm. Yeah, and meetings and connections and all of that stuff is kind of an ongoing process. Yeah, I mean, on the relationship side of things, I am definitely not the one to ask those questions of, but in terms of, showing off the tech and going to CES and South by Southwest and Slush and all of these different shows where you can meet people that, aren't necessarily in your network, but might be of value or have interest in what you're doing. That's kind of a critical thing for startups to do.
Okay, if somebody was like an outsider, because you definitely brought me into tech. Like my first experience to go to anywhere tech related was South by Southwest, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and like literally landing in the middle of that, I didn't even know what I was dealing with. Like it was something that was, is that the one that you would recommend for someone who is looking to say like, man, this is so interesting. I would like to just go and walk the walk for a little bit.
South by is a really good one because it's paired with music and film and all of those things. There's a bit of something for everyone. So even if you get there and you're like, yeah, I'm not so into this tech thing, there's still a ton of stuff that you'll do and enjoy. If you're looking on the pure tech side, something like CES is just, I mean, I feel like a kid in a candy store there. You can go to CES and look around, and not only are there a whole ton of startups there that are kind of up and coming, and you can go and see what's maybe on the horizon, but you can go and look at companies that are, well-established companies. You get the Sonys, the LGs, all of those companies, and you can go and look at products there that you will probably not see in retail stores for 2 to 3 years after the show.
Mm. And that's something that I noticed as well. We went to Augmented World Expo and seeing
Mhm.
some of the stuff. Like one of the ones I was really impressed with was Wrench.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
like
fantastic.
yeah, I guess to describe what they do is they take video footage
Mhm.
and they run it through. Well, they basically understand the orientation of the bodies to the point where in a crowd you could isolate and tell whether or not someone had something in their hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think an easy summary of it is that they're doing multiple motion capture without the suits.
Yeah, because when you see those, you ever see the actors that are doing the stuff that for motion capture and they're wearing like the spandex with the light bulbs on it, and there's
Yep,
normally
they
like
got.
green or blue behind them.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep,
so they're able to do that, but like at like massive scale.
and without the suits.
Yeah, that's something
You
that's going to be
would.
really neat, especially when you take a look at how people are going to be able to register movement into places like virtual reality and metaverse.
One of their demos that I love is that they have a screen that's essentially like a full length mirror, and you can stand in front of it, and they can turn you into different things. So you see your reflection copying exactly what you do, even with people walking behind you and all of this stuff, and you'll see them in the reflection. But you could be, a gorilla or whatever, and they'll. It's pretty impressive to see that.
Well, yeah, that was one that I thought was super neat, and there was also a few other ones. Like I remember this guy Dexter, he had um, he had a wristband that would overcome tremors,
Hmm.
and seeing what
I
people
remember
were.
him.
Yeah, he's super awesome, and also the people that were talking about what your avatar was going to be like in a metaverse. Like we were talking to people about this in like 2018, 2017, and they actually had reasonably developed ideas.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things you'll always see at those conferences is you'll see, even if it's not the company that brings it to market, you'll see the ideas before they get there.
And for the people that are maybe following your footsteps, the people that are like, I have a lot of interest in computers. What would you say to somebody who wanted to see if they would like the next level? Where do you start?
Oh boy. I mean, for a starter, if it's not something that you have a passion for, then yes, you still have the capacity to make a living at it. You could still be decent at it. But typically for me, I mean, to find somebody who is going to be really, really good and passionate about it, it's going to be somebody that started doing it before they ever went to school for it. Um, I think that there is value in that freedom to learn and create outside of the structure of a classroom. Because I think that people who start out by taking it in school, somebody who's like, oh, okay, well, I finished high school. What am I going to go into? Well, I'm going to try computers because, I know there's jobs there. They tend to end up in a position where they've learned very rote, like problem A has solution A, problem B has solution B. And you kind of lose that think outside of the box thinking.
So you
Um,
would call those like almost like the journeymen of tech.
yeah, yeah, that's
Like they're gonna
probably.
fix your pipes when they're broken. They can wire your house.
Yeah, but if you've got some new type of building, they're not necessarily the one to call.
Right. Like if you want to decide what the future is or
Yeah.
make massive change, then it's almost like you have to get like then there's also the people that are kind of like architects, right?
Mhm.
But beyond them are almost like what we see as being the artists.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of, I think, the aspiration that most people. And if you don't have that aspiration, that's fine. I mean, people can still go in; they can still be very serviceable as programmers and technology developers. But I think if you're interested in kind of a startup world, then there needs to be not just a passion for solving the problems and thinking outside the box and being able to find new ways to do things, but also the willingness and ability to do more than just that. Because in a startup, especially early on in a startup, everybody wears a whole bunch of hats. There's no single job that you're going to be doing.
I see what you mean. And also you have to almost build your job. Like the entrepreneurship part of startup is the real part, and that's probably what crushes the most people.
Yeah, I mean there's. Hmm. I'm trying not to say things that I know are echoing phrases that Chandra uses because I don't want her to feel like she can't use them next week. Uh, but I mean, definitely Definitely, it's a different lifestyle being involved in a startup. It's like investors who are, you know, safe investors versus high risk investors. The reward is much bigger, but you have to be willing to take the risk.
I totally well identify with that, but that's something that it's great to hear from you because there are some people that might recognize that their nephew it doesn't use computers like other people do,
Hmm. Yeah,
right? Like,
and if that's the case, I would say foster that as much as you can.
is there like a lot of people know that there's a bunch of different coding languages? Would there be like if you were going to buy a book for your niece because you noticed that the way she's using computers is a little bit advanced just to see if she'd be interested, would you suggest a specific language?
I personally wouldn't, because for me, languages all become kind of the same thing. Just like we have, you know, so many different languages. There's English, French, Spanish. All, you know, there's so many different languages, but they're all used to communicate similar ideas. And it's the
Mhm.
same thing with programming, where it's all just different dialects to communicate the same things. And so, to me, it's more important to have an understanding of those underlying things. And I would actually say that exposure to different languages is probably more important than mastering a specific one initially. I mean, over time, you're going to want to master some specifics just because that's going to be very important to being able to do some more complex things. But in terms of learning the fundamentals and how things work and getting to that point, I think it's important that people have exposure to a lot of different things.
I would agree. Well, I really appreciate you sharing about that. Like, because a lot of people would think that there's going to be one that's better than another, but I like that your idea is if you want to be an artist, you got to paint in many colors.
Yeah, I mean, there's a new language that comes out every year or two, and it's no different than fashion in that there are trends where, you know, right now, if you look at the world of anything that's SaaS and web based, almost everything is being built with Node. But a couple of years ago, it was Angular. A couple of years, you know, it changes every few years. Uh, and actually, one of the drawbacks to all of that I see is that we are moving into higher and higher level languages, meaning that the abstraction and the need to understand the underlying hardware and all of this stuff is less and less. And to me, that means that the people who are able to talk to that hardware and stuff at a lower level, while there may be fewer jobs available in that realm, the value of those jobs will continue to increase because it's like losing an art. So you look at so I was trying to pair it to the language paradigm, and you know something like Latin comes to mind, where you know nobody really speaks Latin anymore. But if they were to find an old Latin book, you need somebody who speaks Latin to understand what's in it. A perfect example is that years ago there was a job posting by NASA that they were having trouble filling, and I can't recall if it was Fortran or COBOL. They're both two languages that were used in like the 60s, and a lot of their legacy stuff was programmed with this language. And they posted a job with $1 million salary for somebody that had the competency to understand and do this stuff. And I
Wow.
think the job posting stayed open for 2 years because they couldn't find anybody. Because the people who
Wow.
had the level of skill that they needed in order to do the job were either dead or retired.
Yeah, because it wouldn't just be like you could go learn it and be a beginner. You would need to understand it at like a doctorate level.
Right, right. And so finding somebody who had that qualification, I don't know if that position ever got filled.
That's incredible. Those are some weird problems,
Yeah, yeah.
you
I
know?
mean, have more and
It's like
more
the modern
languages that come out,
hieroglyph.
and exactly.
Well, I really appreciate you coming and sharing with me. Is there anything that you would like to give to a message of people that might be looking from the outside in? You know, if maybe your 12-year-old self was watching this now and thinking, I don't know, what would you want to tell the people that may follow in your footsteps?
I mean, I think that what I would say is follow something that you're passionate about. Find a way to make that work for you. The best thing to me is when what you enjoy becomes what you do. Because at that point, does it really work?
Totally, because if you weren't doing it, would you be doing it anyway?
Right.
Well, that's incredible. This is Leadership Line of Sight, and joining me is Scott Edgar. He is the co-founder and CTO of ARIS MD, who is changing medicine to the same degree of magnitude that mobile navigation changed car travel. My name is Taylor Hack. I am the marketing strategist at Gravidia, and I hope that the rest of your day is remarkable. Cheers.
Thanks, Taylor.